Good evening, and thank you for tuning in tonight. I am New York City Councilman Chaim, and you're listening to Chaim on the Radio. I'm live here in the studio tonight, joined by my co-host, Dr. Faye Zakheim, and we are filling in tonight for Brenner on the Talkline Communications Network. Good evening, Faye.
Hi, how are you?
Good evening.
Good to hear your voice.
Thank you.
Good evening,
Good to hear your voice, too. Good evening. And to our listeners, our call number here in the studio is 718-303-9090. Again, it's 718-303-9090. Tonight, we are talking on a heavy topic, discussing homelessness and how the city's shelter system continues the cycle of homelessness instead of helping people overcome the challenge. People can become homeless for any number of reasons, including domestic abuse, mental illness or unemployment, many other reasons why someone can remain homeless. The city classifies someone as homeless if they are not living in their own home. So that could include someone who's staying with a relative because they were evicted, someone who is living in the shelter system, and of course anyone who is living on the street. Now, there is no shame in being homeless, and many homeless individuals are simply down on their luck, struggling to find a job so they can get their life back on track. However, the city's shelter system is fairly incompetent and providing very limited support to assist homeless individuals from transitioning out of homelessness and into permanent housing. And because of this failure, a large number of homeless people end up constantly revolving through the shelter system, unable to receive the help that they desperately need. You might be wondering why I have decided to address this topic this week on the radio program. Well, the reason is because the city has proposed a new homeless shelter site right here in our district on Neptune Avenue. The location sits at the intersection of Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Sheepshead Bay. So this location, if you walk 2 blocks in either direction, you can end up in Brighton Beach. You walk 2 blocks in a different direction, you end up in Manhattan Beach. In a third direction, you end up in Sheepshead Bay. It's also within 1,000 feet of Bay Academy, which is a school in my district on Emmons Avenue. And there are serious concerns with this particular site, which we will address throughout the show. And that is not to say that this community is not a welcoming place. In fact, a family shelter located in Sheepshead Bay in my district, in our district, has been warmly supported by local residents. We host food drives, school supply giveaways, and other events for the women and children in that shelter. And in fact, a woman who lived in the Sheepshead Bay family shelter actually interned in my office for a couple of months until she and her son were able to transition to permanent housing, and were also able to find her employment. She was able to do that because the shelter staff worked with her to help her find a job, and a supportive housing faculty where she was able to live independently and care for her son in a loving environment. And that is what we should expect from a shelter system, a place where folks can rest their head for a few weeks or months while they get their life in order. Unfortunately, a shelter like that is rare. And I have to say, as the chair of the veterans in New York City Council, my first hearing in 2017 was at the veteran shelter. And I made it my business the first few months as chair to visit every single veteran shelter throughout the city of New York. And we have many beautiful shelters that accommodate veterans. For example, Jericho Project. It looks like a 5-star hotel. And veterans actually beg me to get in there, where we speak to Jericho to transition people into their facility, where they have extremely, very well-run, supportive services, where from there they go into permanent housing. Now, I am opposed to the proposed shelter in my district on Neptune Avenue for many reasons. But most predominantly it is because there is no plan for supportive services. Instead, it is planned to be a building with beds, a place where people can have a hot meal, a warm bed to sleep in, and that's it. There is a fundamental problem with the system, and that's what we are going to be talking about tonight. And what the city is basically doing with these shelters, and the mayor has made a commitment to open up a shelter in every district in New York City to house single male homeless individuals in these shelters, and with very limited services. And what I would love to see is a shelter that has supportive services that could put people back on their feet. And what the city is basically doing with these shelters that they're placing all across the city is stockpiling homeless people with 7 people per room. And we're going to be speaking about this throughout the program. I have 2 colleagues of mine who will be on the radio, live on the air, and as well as one of my constituents who is also a environmentalist. And this specific shelter is the city wants to build on Neptune Avenue will be built on top of a former gas station, and there's many environmental issues with that. So we're going to be speaking about that later on. So once again, our call-in number in the studio is 718-303-9090, 718-303-9090. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, I will welcome 2 of my colleagues to offer their perspectives on this very broad issue.
Talkline Network Radio, America's longest-running Jewish broadcast network, the voice of the Jewish community.
Here is your host.
Welcome back, and you're listening to Chaim on the Radio, 620 on the AM dial, and I'm here live in the studio with my co-host, Dr. Faye Zakheim, and we want to welcome my colleague, Councilmember Bob Holden, who represents the 30th Council District in Queens. Councilman Holden is a rare voice of reason in the City Council and one of the most outspoken members when it comes to discussing problems within this district and also how the city handles the homeless. We are also joined by one of my newest colleagues, congratulations, and that's Councilmember Darma Diaz. Councilmember Diaz won a special election to represent the 37th District in Brooklyn, and she has a very unique perspective on the homeless crisis here in New York City, and I want to welcome both of you here live on the air. Welcome.
Hi, Chaim. It's great to be on Chaim on the Radio.
It's great to be back because you were on before, right? Great to be back.
That's right.
Yeah, and Darma, welcome. Congratulations on being now a new member in the City Council.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for being on your show.
Yeah, thank you for being on. And Darma, I want to start off first with you. I wanted to have you on the show tonight for several reasons. And first, because I know you worked for many years in the shelter system, providing support for homeless individuals as a director of housing services. And you have a very perspective on how the city runs these shelters and the support services that they have for individuals. And the second reason is because I know that as a young mom, you personally experienced homelessness, and I think both of those experiences give you a very unique perspective on the homeless crisis. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts on some of these shelters that the mayor has committed to putting in throughout the city. Like I mentioned early in the program, that as the chair of veterans, the supportive housing and permanent housing is so important for individuals living in shelters, and also for the surrounding communities where they can welcome and work with people in the shelter system. And what the mayor is saying, I think it's called changing the wave. So he wants to open up these homeless shelters throughout the district, throughout the city, before he leaves office, and he wants to change the wave. And I always tell the mayor, I said, you want to change the wave of how you deal with the city, rather than making it one size fits all for every single area. And this particular district, this particular homeless shelter in my district is within 1,000 feet of a school. And it's so important to have the permanent housing and the supportive housing for individuals in these shelters. So let's hear your perspective on the homelessness in the city of New York, and with your experience that you had working in these homeless shelters.
Well, definitely, I have a 13-year experience within the shelter system, and just to hear transitional housing. For those that don't know the difference, basically the conversation is transitional housing, which means you're there for 6 months to a year, and then hopefully you move into permanent housing. When we're speaking of supportive housing, it means there's a nonprofit organization that's a part of your process. I'm comfortable with supportive housing if we have CBOs that are going to provide perfect services and ideal services. In our conversation earlier today, you mentioned the setup being in a dorm setting, which that I am not in favor of, and I would not support that. Housing within the shelter system, particularly dealing with moms that had to share DV units, which is domestic violence units. When I heard our conversation earlier today in reflection, it's impossible for me to believe that anyone would think it's comfortable to put 4 to 6 individuals into one space to share. If anything, COVID has shown us that that's unhealthy, it's unsanitary. Can you please share with me a little more on what your vision is?
Yes, I spoke to Commissioner Banks today, and he's the commissioner for our listeners. He's the commissioner. He has the oversight on all the homeless shelters. And I told him it's unacceptable to have a homeless shelter putting in 7 people per room. I said, if you have one person per room with supportive services, people need to live. People need to learn how to be independent, especially if someone has a mental illness. They need those services. They need mental health professionals on hand. But in the city's mind, they want to, like what I said before, they want to take the homeless off the street to show, look, we took the homeless off the street. But many of the homeless people, they don't even want to go into these shelters. They feel unsafe. And we need to listen to their voices. And having such a shelter in a district, in any district, I would say, without the proper services and just to stockpile them in rooms and put them in there is totally unacceptable. And I know, Darma, I know that Councilmember Holden has faced off with the city just last year about a homeless shelter that moved into his district. And I want to hear from Bob as well, Bob Holden, Councilmember Bob Holden, to share his story with our listeners. And many of our listeners are neighbors of the proposed site in my district, and I know they are eager to learn about his fight to better inform our listeners and the people within these districts who are not receptive to what the city is doing because, like I said, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And the city needs to listen to their leaders. The city needs to listen to their elected officials and work with them because I think we all want the same thing, getting people off the streets and into permanent housing.
It has to be permanent.
Yes. And that's exactly.
Yeah, we could all chime in. Let's all have a conversation about this. Go ahead.
Let me just approach the subject of large shelters. And you mentioned about working with the council members, working with elected officials, which they don't. They pick the location, they go into procurement, they don't involve anyone, and they won't even sit down with us, a council member or any elected official, to talk about possible locations that might be better in the community, might fit better, it might work better in that particular area, and then to tell us how many homeless families or how many homeless individuals we have, which you can't get that information. And so they refuse to give you the information. And by the way, you were mentioning 7 to a room. We have shelters. We have a shelter here to 12 to 15 men in one room in a congregate shelter. It's a dormitory-style shelter. They have no privacy. They're thrown in with strangers. And many of the men that we have are coming out of either Rikers or jail. In fact, in the General Welfare Committee, we learned last year that 40% of the people coming out of jails go directly into the homeless system. So why would a neighborhood, and especially mine's a middle-class neighborhood, working class, we work hard, people save all their lives to buy a 1 or 2 family home. Now we have literally a large warehouse with 200 men, and they have no roots in the community. And what you were mentioning earlier, the mayor mentioned in early 2017, it was called Turning the Tide. That means he wanted to house the homeless in their own neighborhoods. Great idea. Love it. Love that idea. Keep the families in the neighborhood that they grew up in. Keep the men who worked in the community and let's say they're down on the luck, keep them in their own community. Yet he's done the opposite. The mayor announces things. He's good at announcing things, never good at following through. So New York City spends $1.2 billion a year on housing the homeless, and this is all on, under the leadership or the lack of leadership of Stephen Banks, the DHS commissioner, Department of Homeless Services commissioner, who tries to sell you a bill of goods and tries to do it secretly. But he won't work with you on the shelter population. He won't work with you the type of shelter that will fit best in your community. And listen, I grew up in this neighborhood. I lived here 69 years already. My mother was born in the neighborhood. My grandfather had a farm here. We know what the neighborhood can use and what they would accept. He won't even work with us.
So I think it's more, that the mayor came up and made up his mind that he wants to change tide. He wants to come up with these new shelters, like you said, it's dormitory-style shelters. And I proposed, I said, I have a lot in my district, and since 2017, and listen to this, Darma, since 2017, I have been working with HPD and city agencies to put a plan together for senior housing. We have many seniors, even in the city of New York, that are homeless. And to make a plan for senior housing, the property is owned by Department of Transportation. It's a city entity. And this is schlepping. This is all the way back from 2017 without any movement. Now, the mayor comes up with a plan, and they're panicking because he's out of office in a year. And so he wants to put up a shelter. So I went back to him, and I even called the mayor tonight, and I spoke to Commissioner Banks. I said, why do I have to wait since 2017 to put up affordable senior housing and senior housing for seniors throughout the city? Why do I have to wait since 2017? And now you're rushing to put people that may be 50 or older or even 60 or older into these single male shelters without any type of supportive services. And that's totally unacceptable. So, go ahead, Darma.
I was going to actually add on one more point. Hi, it's Dr. Faye, a therapist from NYU. So we worked with the homeless. This is like from a completely different angle. It's an honor to have you both on the phone. All three of you, actually, all three council members. That you're just amazing. But what I want to say is that we worked with the homeless. Get ready for this. We went down into the subway system to bring homeless into shelters. Do you know that within 1 day or 2 days, they left these shelters? They went back into the subway systems. It was freezing cold weather, and a lot of these homeless people, they're mentally ill. They don't want to be in a homeless shelter. They need mental health services. They need people to take care of them. But to put them into a neighborhood where regular people are living and children are living and without services for mentally ill, it's just not, they don't want to be there. They're going to leave. They will walk out. This astounded me that we would go back down to the subway system. It was the same people we were taking out all the time and taking them over to a shelter. So that's it from a whole other perspective, from a mental health perspective.
So if you have people in a shelter without the proper services, and like you said, Darma, you need a provider who really cares and who gets paid to make sure that they get the full supportive services. So if people are in the shelter and they don't have employment, what do they do all day? Right? I mean, from your experience, they probably
they loiter. They're outside. They walk in the streets.
Yeah, they're walking the streets.
But Darma, you know what happens? That's what this is how they try to sell it to the community. Stephen Banks, he said, you're going to get an employment shelter. These men are ready for employment. I said, that's better than possibly another shelter, but still, the smaller ones are better. Well, it turned out there was no employment. There's no real services. Like you just said, the men are hanging out. Listen to this. This shelter opened up in late February of 2020. By the end of the year, there were 39 arrests in that shelter. The men were arrested for a host of things. One man hit a homeowner who was sitting on his stoop a block away came up to him, hit him over the head with a pipe, and took his cell phone. Another man was caught masturbating in the backyard of a residence. Another man was caught urinating, and the same thing in a schoolyard. We've had 39 arrests. We've had 492 911 calls related to that shelter. So when Stephen Banks tries to sell any neighborhood on a shelter, be wary of that, because they're trying to shove these shelters, very large shelters. I propose faith-based shelters, smaller ones up to maybe 20 to 30 to 40. I have a lot of convents in the area. I have a lot of parishes that are empty, rectories that are empty. I proposed a few locations. The diocese is willing to work with the city. The mayor originally Stephen Banks said no to that. It wasn't cost effective, blah, blah, blah. Then the mayor comes around last year and says, we'll try to do that. We're going to work with faith-based organizations. Well, again, the large shelters are the things that make the money for the shelter industrial complex. And there's a whole bunch of them out there. And that's what feeds into the system. That's where the $1.2 billion, most of it goes to these so-called not-for-profits and developers.
Well, I have to be honest with you all that the environment that I came from was 20 families, 2 shelters, 2 separate buildings, each 20 families. It's a whole lot easier to deal with and provide deliverables, as opposed to clients that came to me after being in shelters that were 100 units or larger. If you don't have a strong nonprofit organization that really has their hands on the cases, it's a problem. It's easy for services not to be provided. So I'm listening to what you're saying, and it seems somewhat backwards to me to not, why the system does not want to work with faith-based organizations, smaller environments where you can get the direct services that are needed, especially when we're working with a population that needs their hands-on.
Yeah, and many religious groups want to help, and they can bring down the cost of these shelters if the city would just work with them. But the city is really working with these, like I said before, these developers that probably gave to many campaigns, or they're working with these so-called not-for-profits, which are not for-profit, because they all get paid very, very well. For instance, the 5-year contract at the shelter near me, it's for $65 million. To house, right now it's housing 100 men during the COVID. And again, in dormitory-style shelter layout. That, by the way, that contract, again, up to 200 men. We had, during the pandemic, in the early days, they had 100 in there, then they upped it to 200. So they were violating their own COVID social distancing rules. So, and of course it spreads in the shelter, but the impact on the neighborhood. We had drug use all around that shelter. We had men shooting up outside in stairwells where kids walk to school. So we had.
But what's the staff? I can forgive me, but I go back to staff. What you're telling me are things that are hideous and insane to me, because as a case manager, as a director, there's no way that I would have allowed that environment to happen. So I understand that there are communities that are uncomfortable with having displaced people within their neighborhood. I understand it's impactful, it's disturbing, but it's really unfortunate that even the clients are exposed to this. Right?
Exactly.
So you're saying that
Again,
these behaviors are allowed, and the staff is saying it's okay?
Yeah, but what you mentioned about, and we spoke, we have street homeless now, which we never did, and because they don't want to go back in the shelter, like you mentioned before.
They're scared, but they're scared stiff.
Right.
They're scared to be in there.
Yeah, and that, 6 years ago, I walked over to Commissioner Banks, and I offered him to visit and to take my time to visit every single shelter throughout the city of New York. I had a plan. I went to the mayor with the plan, and I offered him. They never took me to offer. I had several meetings with Commissioner Banks after I approached the mayor, and next morning Commissioner Banks was in my office on several occasions. And, even today we had a budget a meeting with the mayor, and the mayor mentions, the rich, we had to speak about how to get revenue. So the mayor was speaking about it. He goes, the rich got richer during COVID. Many rich people got richer. So we're going to increase the income taxes. And one of the questions I asked the mayor is, Mr. Mayor, you mentioned the rich are getting richer, but you didn't mention how much the city spends for dormitory-style shelters where the rich get richer on the back of our homeless population, and how much the city spends on these homeless shelters, like Bob mentioned, opposed to spending the money on permanent supportive housing. And I asked the mayor if we could discuss the amount of money the city is spending on shelters that are only opening to, like you said, having stockpiling the homeless rather than giving them the needed and real supportive and permanent housing, where they're putting in between 7 and 14 people per room. And that's totally unacceptable. Like I mentioned, I have a family shelter in my district. My community is very welcoming, and we welcome everyone. But when the city is coming in and the mayor has a plan, and the mayor has shown already, has proven over the years how incompetent he is throughout the years that he's been in office. So when you come with a plan, you need to have a conversation with the community. You need to have a conversation with people living on the street. I have conversations with them where I know people who are sleeping on the streets on first-name basis, where unfortunately you cannot force a homeless person to go into a shelter, but why should we have to force anyone to go into a shelter? They should say, yes, I want to be in the shelter. I feel safe there. But unfortunately, they don't. They don't. And I told Commissioner Banks that I'm going to continue my 5-borough tour to speak to homeless people and put this on video. I want to hear from the people living on the streets why they don't want to go into shelters. Maybe Commissioner Banks needs to have town hall meetings with homeless people who are living on the streets and listening to them rather than listening to Mr. Mayor. And that's how we could resolve this issue. But don't tell us you're putting a homeless shelter in our district, because once it's called supportive housing, it comes out of the jurisdiction of Commissioner Banks or Department of Homeless Services, and the city wants to show, no, Department of Homeless Services is taking upon themselves to take off homeless people from the streets. But it's not beneficial for them. It's not beneficial for the community when the services, like Darma you mentioned, when you don't have providers who are asked to give those supportive services to them. So unfortunately, when something like this happens, we cannot sit back and let this mayor do what he wants, when he wants, how he wants. So we need to stick up. We need to stick together. We need to send one message. We want to take homeless people off the streets. We want permanent and supportive housing where these people could not only, where these people don't have to transition to anything. They could go straight directly into permanent housing. And you know that during COVID, people left the city. They got tired of the city. We have tens of thousands of vacancies throughout the city. Tens of thousands. I'm sure property owners throughout the city of New York are willing to take in maybe 10 apartments, 15 apartments, and the city should offer those supportive services to them. And it will cost a lot less if the city pays the rent than to open a homeless shelter where, I think, Bob, you mentioned how much does the city pay? How much does it end up costing?
City spends $1.2 billion a year, and probably more than that because of the COVID this year and last year. But Chaim,
yeah, I estimate it's an average of $5,000 to have a person in shelter per month.
Per month, $5,000 a person in shelter per month. Listeners, are you listening to that? $5,000 per month. You could get an apartment now in New York City, even the luxury apartments. Rents went down. $1,800, $2,000, $2,200 luxury apartments in a luxury building, right? $5,000 per person.
With all this money that they're spending, why wouldn't they make smaller shelters that fit into, let's say, smaller kind of 1 and 2 family neighborhood style residents? Why wouldn't they make the shelter fit the zoning? Instead, they build these large monstrosities in kind of, low-rise.
It's warehousing people. It's warehousing.
So it's never going to be accepted. The people, it's going to stick out. I said that. I said everything in the neighborhood, even though it didn't come from the shelter, will be blamed for it. Somebody gets mugged. Somebody's house gets burglarized. Somebody, gets robbed by gunpoint. They're going to blame the shelter automatically. And it may not be the case, but it'll never be accepted. If you're the mayor of the city of New York, or you're the commissioner of DHS, wouldn't you want to, have the shelter be accepted by the neighborhood? No. This mayor, and certainly Stephen Banks, who's probably the biggest liar of any commissioner I've met in my 3 years in the council, he lies. Everything he says, you can't trust. Everything he promises, he doesn't deliver. And he's endangering the lives of the residents of not only the shelter, but of the surrounding communities. And he's done this throughout the New York City, because what Darma said, they'd rather live in the subways. That's why you see the explosion of the number of homeless in the subways or on the streets. And I've never seen this many homeless on the streets of my neighborhood. We used to have 1 or 2 maybe in the entire district. Now, there's probably hundreds in the neighborhood. We have some encampments even. So this is the congregate shelter warehousing that we talked about that they're trying to put down now in your district, Chaim. So I would just tell the residents, fight this, resist it, because try to negotiate other locations or smaller shelters. 3 or 4 smaller ones work better than one large one.
Yeah, to be quite frank with you both and with the audience, I had a decent conversation today with Commissioner Banks in reference to a pop-up hotel, and not pop-up, but it was built to be 110 hotel units, and it was opened and it was converted into housing for men. And I was told that there's a new hotel that's being built, and that the owners intend for it to be also single shelter for men. And again, my conversation was pretty nice. It was decent. And I'm hoping that the conversation I had is real, and that my experience is different than what you've all had. The area that I represent has amongst the highest number of referrals into shelter. So when you say about not wanting in communities, fortunately for me, I want folks back into my community, but with the understanding that they're going to come into shelters, that they're going to receive the proper services.
And that's the key, Darma. The key you just mentioned is having the proper services. And I don't think anyone is opposed to having shelters. We all have shelters in our district. Like I mentioned earlier in the program, I have a shelter in my district. And we welcome them, and they volunteer. They come into my office. We find them jobs, and they call me. They're always welcome. We always welcome them. And it's so important that people should know, and the city officials should know, we all welcome
the right way.
Have the right way. And this is not the right way by putting something into a neighborhood without having any conversation and making backroom deals with developers and with providers, backroom deals. And this specific provider that we have here in my district, they have hundreds of open violations. And that's a problem. They have open violations in all the shelters. And it comes to a point where I'm going to ask our public advocate to put the shelter on their slumlord list. Because if they have as many open violations as it's been reported, then they should be placed on the slumlord list, and the city should not deal with them. And that is also unacceptable. we welcome. We
certainly do welcome, and we do have we have soup kitchens, and we certainly have food pantries in the neighborhood. We have smaller shelters and faith-based. We have that. We've had it before. We welcome that. But when they gutted a warehouse and they put a shelter in Glendale in my district, and I took a tour when it opened up. They could have designed it much better. You know what it looks like, Darma and Chaim? You know what this shelter looks like when you go inside? A jail. Because on each floor, there are security stations, on the east side and the west side of each floor. Then there's metal detectors downstairs. I understand that. There's a security. But it's very Spartan-like. It looks like a glorified, slightly better jail or halfway house. It's not a home. It's not even like a shelter. It feels like a jail. And they could have built the individual rooms, because every human being would love their own space, right? And for a little bit more money, they could have done that, and they wouldn't have had the fights, they wouldn't have the arrests, and they would have a better outcome. That these residents could get on with their lives and have a better life and learn a trade or something, but not in a congregate shelter. They're always getting into trouble. They're fighting.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, and I want to thank you both. And I just want to tell our listeners, and I say this almost every single week, don't rely on your elected officials to be your voice, because we are only as strong as our constituents are behind us and supporting us. And that is so important. So we need your support. And we need to send a message to this administration that, yes, we care about our homeless population. They need to be housed. But you're not going to tell us how it's going to be done when we can see it's black and white that you are going about it the wrong way. We need supportive housing. Listen to the council members. Listen to the elected leaders. Listen to the constituents. And by working together, we could get this done. So to Commissioner Banks, you better start listening. To my friend Bob Holden, and Darma, you have been really a strong voice in the few months in 1 month.
I'm fuming right now. I'm trying to tell you, but I'm fuming. It sounds to me that transitional housing, which was supposed to have been temporary, has become a permanent system.
Yeah, exactly. So you know something? If you're fuming, you could stay on the air. Could we have another guest coming on? I like when my colleagues are fuming. So
no, I'm sure you do, but it's like I also come from a background of family members that have worked in the single shelters in the area of policing. So yeah, I'm fuming because I know both sides of it. The NYPD piece to it, but then also just trying to run an effective environment, and knowing that the facility where I came from, which is faith-based, we dedicated so much of our time and effort in securing that we didn't have violations. Because violations is lack of service. That's a disrespect.
Definitely, yeah.
But to know that to this day we still have buildings that are operating with violations, is horrible.
Yeah, and they need to be held accountable for those violations as well. And this is.
I know that in my district, thankfully, there were a few providers that were not so good providers, and they've lost the right to continue to provide services, which was good for me and making my life a little easier, because the system has recognized that they were bad players in this process. So I welcome this conversation, and I look forward.
Thank you very much.
Being a positive influence.
And Darma, I'm going to invite you to my house for a Sabbath meal once COVID is over, and I'd love to have you. I'd love to have you. And I just want to tell our listeners, you're listening to Councilmember Bob Holden, who represents the 30th Council District in Queens. And you also listen to Councilmember Darma Diaz, who just won a special election to represent the 37th District in Brooklyn. So I want to thank you both for being on the air, and I'm looking forward to having you both again. And so thank you so much.
Thank you, Chaim. Thank you, Darma.
Thank you. We are now joined by my good friend, Ida Sanoff, and Ida is a community activist and a fighter for environmental safety and awareness. She is extremely knowledgeable, and she's here to speak about a major environmental concern, with the proposed shelter sites on Neptune Avenue in our district. Welcome, Ida. You're live on the air.
Okay, thank you, Councilman Deutsch, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for, in the short time, you have done an incredible amount of community outreach and letting people know what's going on and investigating all possible options to deal with this situation. My concern is what this site has been before. It's one thing if you're a private developer and you decide to take a site that may be contaminated and put private money into cleaning it up and then developing it. It's another thing if you're the city of New York and you're using taxpayer money. And in addition to constructing a shelter, in addition to operating a shelter, you're going to have to spend additional money to clean up and remediate the location. And that is what we suspect is going to happen with this new shelter. The site, since the 1920s, it's been a gas station. It's been a service center for a car dealership. Usually with situations like this, we call them brownfields. And they require investigation. They frequently still have underground storage tanks that might have contained gasoline or other oil-based compounds, and those tanks have to be located. They have to be removed. There's soil that has to be cleaned up. And this isn't just a matter of going in with a backhoe and digging around. Sometimes they have to dig monitoring wells. And after they finally locate whatever is underneath and clean it up as best they can, there's sometimes still residual chemicals that remain in the soil that can evaporate and enter the building. So this requires a whole system to be built into the base of the building to trap these chemicals and properly treat them. So needless to say, this is a very, very expensive proposition. You have to hire special consultants. The testing is outrageously expensive. And it's taxpayer money that's being used to do this, adding to the costs of this whole project. And then there's the health and safety of the surrounding community. Because we've seen in other city projects, there was another project in southern Brooklyn that was completed a few years ago. It wasn't a shelter, it was a different type of municipal project. And there were concerns about soil contaminants, etc. And the city assured us that they were going to have an on-site environmental monitor, and there were all sorts of special conditions that were going to protect the public health and safety. Well, guess what? We found out that there was no monitoring, or the monitors weren't doing their jobs, and that the special conditions that were put in there for safety were being ignored. And it wasn't a city official that discovered this. It was people, everyday people, that went around and looked at the site and said, hey, you know, there's something strange going on here. And they, in turn, went back to their local elected officials who went back to the city, and in this case, New York State was involved. And the city said, okay, we'll do a better job. So, but then they kept neglecting other things. So if you're living next door to one of these sites, you might be exposed to some of these chemicals. We know that they did auto painting there. We don't know if there's lead. We don't know if there are heavy metals. So these have to be cleaned up in order to ensure the safety of the people who will ultimately live in the facility. But the cleanup has to be done safely to protect the surrounding community.
Yeah, and Ida, people don't realize this. Like, you know, we just had a conversation. I had a conversation with two of my colleagues, and we spoke about how the city is incompetent, how they run the shelters, and how the city should have permanent housing and supportive housing. But then you have other things that may be an issue. And like you mentioned, this site was a gas station back in what year was this? In
Well, started since the 1920s.
The 1920s,
gas station,
right? So who knows?
Car repair facility.
Yeah. So who would know that? Like the city could come in. So that's why we need people. We need the eyes and ears, and people like you, Ida, who do their research, and you find out that this used to be a gas station, and this could affect the people who are living at the shelter, and it could affect people living around the shelter. So it's not just about how the city runs a shelter and what the city does when they house homeless people, but it's also about the environmental impact. So we have requested an environmental impact study from Department of Homeless Services, which they agreed on doing. But we also need an environmental study to check what needs to be done as part of the EIS to make sure that it's safe even putting something or constructing something at this location.
Well, I think the cost also has to be figured in. Again, if you're a private developer and you're building a facility with private money, then, spend as much as you like. But if you're the city and you're using taxpayer money, and let's not forget that the city right now has a fiscal crisis, that even before COVID, there were calls, they said, we need more services to seniors, or we need to do more for our schools or for our hospitals. So there is always a need in the city for proper funding, and yet, especially now in a situation where our funding is so limited, in order to make this site habitable, who knows how many extra millions of dollars are going to be spent that are literally going to be buried in the ground with the cleanup. Even if they don't have to do any remediation, they're still going to have to do various studies, and that's very, very costly. And it's fiscally irresponsible, at the very least.
So, you're right about, New York City's facing a budget deficit, and the property is costly, right? So the city has to put money in for the property or for lease, and they usually do it. I think in this specific property, what the commissioner told me is going to be a 3-year lease with a 2-3-year option. And like you heard from my colleague, it costs about $5,000 a month per person to be in this homeless shelter. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, like you mentioned, to remediate this and to have the study by is also costly. So if you take everything and put it together, how much money, how much millions or billions of dollars the city is paying for shelters that don't work. I have a bill in the city council that I sponsored. I'm a prime sponsor that will give a one-shot to people who could prove that they had a loss of income during COVID, and then the city would pay their rent. Now, what happens after May when the rent moratorium ends? Right, the city's going to put in 170 people in the shelter, not the right way, and then you're going to have hundreds of more people who are going to be evicted, and then we're in a crisis again. So it's cheaper. It's cheaper, Ida. It's cheaper to pay people's rents for $1,400-$1,500 a month, or $2,000 a month, and to give the property owners that money who are losing money, who cannot even afford to pay taxes, and put them into permanent housing. And this way, it's a win-win, and it's cheaper for the city to pay for the rent than to end up paying for homeless shelters.
Well, we've all said, we've had other situations before in southern Brooklyn where shelters are coming, and with one voice, everyone has said, if these people have roots in the community, why aren't we building low-income housing or supportive housing? But I think this is something that Councilmember Holden touched on. These shelters are a business. There are entities that are making a lot of money on having these poor, unfortunate people cycle through there for a few months at a time. If you have a permanent population, you're not really going to make any money on it. You're going to have people that are going to get their services that will hopefully return to the community and lead productive, normal, happy lives instead of were told with one shelter, we said, well, how long do people stay in the shelter? They said, well, they stay in the shelter about 7 to 8 months. Well, what happens to them after that? Do they all get apartments? Do they all get homes? And it was like, well, no, some end up here, some end up there. So it's really not solving the problem. And getting back to the money thing, even if they clean up the ground, if they have to install a special system to treat any chemicals that remain there, these chemicals that can evaporate up through the foundation, there's a separate system that has to be installed that has to be monitored pretty much for decades. So that's an additional cost that comes from building on top of a site that may be contaminated. Again, if you're a private developer, you're working with private money, and you can charge more for your condos or your apartments or whatever. But when you're the city of New York and you're using taxpayer money, you're just adding insult to injury here.
And we also didn't touch upon that the fact that it's in the flood zone text amendment, it's in the flood zone, and it's going to cost the city even more. It's going to cost the developer even more, where the city is going to have to pay to make sure that any construction that is done in the flood zone should be according to the flood zone text amendment, and that's also going to be costly.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the flood zone, because a couple of years after Sandy, I looked at the census counts for Coney Island, Brighton Beach, and Sheepshead Bay, and that's roughly 140,000 people at the last census. There currently are not enough shelter beds for all of those people. And even if we do build so-called resilient housing, and we all go, there's some miracle where they could find 140 shelter beds, we're all going to be coming back to streets that are covered with sand, to a lack of electricity, to a lack of cell phone service, to streets where ambulances can't get through.
Evacuation, where we had an issue evacuating people in southern Brooklyn during Sandy, and now with more construction and more people here with no evacuation plan as well.
Well, there's not even enough shelter beds, and this is something that nobody... again, the city of New York printed up these Know Your Zone booklets in I don't know how many different languages. I think everybody, and all we're told is, grab your go bag and go to your shelter. But there's not enough shelter beds, and this is something that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah, correct. Ida, thank you so much. And, let's just, as a community activist, and you've been very involved in southern Brooklyn, so give us your suggestion to our listeners how they can get involved in these efforts. And I know there's a public meeting at Community Board 13, 7 p.m. on Wednesday, January 20th. So if you'd like to come in the public meeting, Department of Homeless Services will be on that Zoom meeting. So if you have any concerns, questions, please send me an email, cdeitch@council.nyc.gov to get the Zoom login information for the public meeting, and that's going to be Wednesday at 7 p.m. On January 20th. And once again, I just want to tell our listeners once again that you need to step up if there is any rallies, any conversations going on. You need to be out there. Don't think that a neighbor of yours will do the work for you. Don't think your elected official is going to do the work for you. Because when we go out there to make our voices heard, you need to come out. You need to step up. And it cannot just be for 1 week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks making noise. Department of Homeless Services, they are already prone to having people come out against their incompetent shelters that they place in different districts. And so they expect you to have a rally. They expect you to speak out against it. But they don't expect for us to come out day after day, week after week, month after month, making noise and holding the city accountable. Because if we don't hold the city accountable, nobody will. So you need to step up. You need to make sure that you come out, monitor the situation, hold your elected officials accountable. Very important. Hold your elected officials accountable. You don't only have a city councilman. There's an assembly member. There's a state senator. There's a Congress member. Okay? Hold your elected officials accountable. Okay? Don't let anyone sweet talk you. So Ida, you were listening to Ida Sanoff, a community activist. She's a environmentalist, I call her, and very knowledgeable. So I want to thank you, Ida, and send my best to your husband, Jeff. So
thank you.
Thank you. And until next week, I want to wish all our listeners a Shabbat Shalom.